Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Regular listeners to the podcast would know that one of our favourite guests is demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. Simon is a co-founder of the Demographics Group, and every time I speak to him, I learn something new about Australia's population, the way we work, the education system, the property market, the list just goes on. I wanted to speak to Simon today about two sectors heading in completely opposite directions, tourism and the property market. Simon, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for having me.
Simon, let's get into immigration and tourism first up. So the ABS recently released some data that shows just how hard COVID-19 has hit tourism. What's the prognosis for the sector?
Well, tourism, of course, declined massively. That's not a big surprise for anyone. So in the 12 months of COVID that the data covered, we, of course, saw a massive decline. Before COVID hit per year, we saw actually 6 million tourists come into Australia. And in the 12 months of COVID, we had 16,000 tourists come to Australia. So that is essentially a whole sector evaporating. And if you think about the average tourist spend, the average money that a tourist in Australia spends, that's $5,300 and a few cents or so. That means that we go from $2.7 billion that we make from inbound tourism down to about 7 million. And that, of course, has repercussions for towns and regions all across Australia. And this sector will not really recover before we open the borders up again.
Wow, and that depends very much on vaccines, presumably. So we could be talking literally, 18 months, 2 years or longer.
Yes, so my not so secret predictions about vaccines is that we will probably see a vaccine passport, meaning that fully vaccinated people are allowed to travel internationally and that they probably go or can go to Australia with a shorter or maybe even no hotel quarantine. And if that's the case, and of course, all presuming this can be done safely, which is the number one priority, then we'll see tourism kick back up because there is so much pent up demand of travel. We're not just talking about tourists, but particularly in Australia, we are missing international students who are, of course, I can't talk about international students without using the term cash cows. We make so much money of international education that, of course, everybody is massively keen to have them back into the country very soon.
On that, do you think that the cash cows, i.e. international students and tourists, there is pent-up demand, but do you think it will ever get back to what it was? And let's start with the international students first, because certainly out of China, there's been a lot of commentary that not necessarily will Australia receive as many foreign students as we have previously. And of course, online learning is something that we all do now, and Zooming and things like that. Do you think it will get back to what it was?
I wouldn't be surprised if we easily surpass demand from pre-pandemic eras, simply because international education hasn't lost its appeal. We still need more than ever English-speaking top-level education. The economies where we get our international students from in India, in China, they are only moving more towards knowledge economy, towards these kind of jobs that require international or top-level university education. So that means the demand hasn't gone anywhere. And if you think about the biggest competitors in the international education space, largely the US, if I am let's say a Malaysian mom of an 18-year-old kid, and I'm thinking about where do I send my baby, when they first leave the house, well, I watched news from the US for the last 4 or 6 years. I'm less likely to send my kids there. The UK has a strong position for international education, but overall, the largest competitor got hit, the US. So there will be more demand for international education to come to Australia.
So that's great news. And then the tourism, do you think the inbound tourism will get back to where it was?
I think so, simply because the rich got richer during the pandemic. That's an actual truism. And the rich that can travel, they will want to travel. And overall, internationally speaking, Australia actually strengthened its position. In Australia, we get a bit caught up with narratives like, the Victorians screwed up the hotel quarantine program and they made sure that we had to go into lockdown. What a shame. The international narrative is quite different. Internationally speaking, people look at Melbourne and say, wow, there was a city of 5 million people that was used to have the pandemic. and now they don't. They managed to get it under control. It's actually even a better narrative than the narrative around Brisbane, where we say, well, there's a town of 3 million people and they never had the pandemic. It's not a nice comeback story, but internationally, people look at Australia and New Zealand, for that matter, in very admiring terms. So we are seen as a safe and secure destination, not just for international travel, also for permanent migration, for a temporary migration for students, and also for international capital.
Okay, just before we leave tourism, does the domestic travel industry make up much of the international? Can it compensate for much of the international tourism?
It can to a degree, absolutely. But it's not the same kind of tourism that you see. You're not traveling as a tourist in your own country for 3, 4, 5 weeks. You're probably not traveling around the country so much, but you're doing smaller trips to your local tourist towns or probably up to Queensland. But it's not enough to compensate for this, particularly because some people in the pandemic started to watch their spending habits a bit more carefully. That said, I can only encourage anyone to take up domestic tourism this year, because you won't be able to travel internationally. And we've seen from, studies and surveys out of the workforce that we move towards being burned out a bit more than we expected. And it does actually do you good to spend a week, on a Queensland beach.
It does. I'm with you on that. Stay with me, Simon. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Simon Kuestenmacher, co-founder of the Demographics Group. You've had a bit to say lately about the impact of the COVID vaccines and whether the lure of reopening borders will be enough to motivate the population to get vaccinated. You've also given some of the arguments for people that people are making against allowing those who have been vaccinated to travel. The whole idea here is that we end up with a two-tiered society, those that have been vaccinated and have far greater freedoms and those that haven't. Where do you think that will take us?
The general argument here is that people say we must not allow special rights to the people that are fully vaccinated, because this way we are discriminating against those people who aren't vaccinated. And particularly in a country where we don't have enough vaccine doses ready just yet, to treat everyone, that's an unfair advantage for those who are vaccinated. And I think tough luck. Really, it's a matter of speed here. We need to vaccinate people as fast as we can, of course, and then we need to make sure we can go back to normal as fast as we can. In Australia, we now have the virus under control, and it's almost like the pandemic never happened. You see people talking about the virus saying like, of course, I forgot about Corona. I didn't bring a mask for public transport, or I forgot to bring one for the Uber, for airport visits, all of this kind of stuff. It just shows how willing we are to go back to normal. But for this to happen, we need to be vaccinated. And this, of course, occurs not just in Australia. That is an international phenomenon where we say fully vaccinated people must get their previous rights of free travel restored as soon as possible. There are too many jobs, too many industries that depend on this. And we might as well give people back their freedoms a bit faster.
Now, the other topic I would like to talk to you about this morning is one close to my heart. It's population growth. And I sort of trained as an economist, and sort of one of the first things you learn really, it's the supply and demand. You have the greater the population, the greater you end up with economic growth. It's a great thing. Now, Australia's population declined for the first time since World War I last year. Firstly, why is it that countries like Australia grow in population? Is it mostly a migration issue, or is it a birth issue? That's the first thing. And why is it so important?
Yeah, so when we look at the population growth that occurred over the last decades in Australia, we saw approximately a growth of 400,000 people per year, more or less. And as a rule of thumb, we say 2/3 of this growth in each year comes from migration. And that's partially permanent migrants, skilled migrants who move here, who move their families, who move themselves over to Australia, and partially by ever more international students being in Australia at any one point in time. And it's an easy way to grow GDP, which is why economists and the treasurer, more importantly, really like migration. It's a great way to grow the country. The other remaining third is from a surplus of births compared to deaths. And in a environment where we're now essentially dealing without migration, there's still a bit of population growth. The reason we saw population decline, it was not in the whole year, but just the last quarter, was that essentially all those temporary visas ran out and that quite a few international skilled workers were repatriated once they lost their jobs or their visas ran out. This will not continue the population decline. We'll go back to essentially a stable population until migration kicks back in, and then migration leads to more population growth as a whole in Australia.
We'll be back with more in a moment. I'm talking to Simon Kuestenmacher, co-founder and director of the Demographics Group. Developed economies generally grow in population. Where is the negative? Is it emerging economies that are, well, they're not shrinking? I'm just interested where these people are coming from. What countries are losing people?
So if you look at the whole world, the countries that are losing population at the fastest rate are countries that are aging and that are doing not so well economically speaking, with a couple of exceptions. So we see, for example, all the old Soviet satellite states. They're declining at fast rate simply because it's an aging population and the young people who want job opportunities elsewhere, they leave the country. Then you have, of course, two countries that stand out as aging economies that are doing absolutely well. And this is Japan and Germany. These are highly industrialized countries, highly mechanized countries where local manufacturing is strong and that see growth within specific regions of the country. Tokyo is still growing within Japan. Within Germany, you have the tech sector of Munich and the startup sector of Berlin really fueling the population growth within a declining country. So that's also important to know that a population decline in a nation isn't evenly distributed. There are still pockets that grow and there are pockets that are shrinking dismally. There are plenty of pockets in Germany where we've seen, for example, the old Eastern states, they've seen a population decline of 20, 30% since the end of the Cold War. And these are dismal areas to look at.
Yeah, so bringing it back to Australia, we're eking out population growth at the moment, then notwithstanding the last quarter of last year. How do we bring that back to the housing market, which is everyone's favourite topic? The housing market is incredibly hot at the moment, but if you don't get that overseas immigration, will that undermine the strength in the market?
Absolutely. So we always need to think about what we actually talk about when we say the housing market. There is no such thing as the Australian housing market. It's localized and it happens different housing products. So we all know this, that now that all the international students, all these skilled workers left Australia, essentially the inner city 1 and 2 bedroom apartment market is suffering. That makes sense. Those people are leaving. There's also another group that tends to live in 1 and 2 bedroom apartments in the inner cities, or tended in the last 10 years or so. That was the millennial generation. The millennial generation 10 years ago, over the last decade, didn't have kids, didn't raise families. This is now happening. That means that this large generation of millennials are leaving their 1 and 2 bedroom apartments in Surrey Hills, in Fitzroy. They're leaving those apartments. They're moving to wherever 3 and 4 bedroom dwellings are available, because all of a sudden the millennials need bedrooms for their 1.7 kids. They need a Zoom room to keep the kids and the cats out of their business calls. So that means this big population migration within Australia is occurring from the inner city to wherever 3 and 4 bedroom dwellings are available. And that's suburbia, that's regional Australia.
So that's one of the reasons why the regions are doing so well this time around.
Absolutely. The first thing is just the millennial phenomenon. That would have occurred even without COVID. It's supercharged, fueled additionally by the COVID trend of working from home. During the pandemic, we managed to have 40 to 50% of all the jobs, essentially all knowledge jobs, to be done remotely. That means that those remote workers now really understand that it's possible to work remotely at least some of the time. So that means that instead of going to the CBD 5 days per week, more and more workers will want to go to the CBD only 2 days per week, maybe. So that means you're probably willing to do a larger commute because you only have to do it once or twice per week. So all of a sudden, the towns that are in commutable distance to the CBD, they will see big population boom.
Yeah, incredible. Simon, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed this morning.
My pleasure.
That was Simon Kuestenmacher, co-founder and director of the Demographics Group. This is a Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.